class. Today is Tuesday, the 12th of May, 2020. Today we're going to talk about story elements. And we're going to talk about story elements in movies first, and then in a story that you're reading. And you'll have a chance to work with your partners today in doing that. So what makes a story a story? You've been learning about this for probably 3 years now, right? And probably even before that, because when you first heard a story, there was something about it, right? Maybe you didn't know what it was yet, but there was just something that made a story a story. So let's talk about what makes a story a story. So a story has some basic elements or parts to it, right? So we have characters, setting, problem, solution, and consequence, right? And these are usually in order. Usually at the beginning of the story, I learned about the characters and the setting, right? So I'm going to put right here a B, and I need to change my color because you can't see that. I'm going to put a B right here because you know a story as beginning, middle, and end. That's when you were first taught how to retell a story, right? But when you retold the story, in the beginning you always talked about the characters and where they were, right? And then something happens in the middle of the story, right? Because a story goes in a sequence, or else it really wouldn't be a story. So usually this happens in the middle of the story, right? Usually the characters have a problem. And we might find a little about the problem at the beginning, but it's usually in the middle, right? There's a problem. And if a story didn't have a problem, it wouldn't be a very good story. For example, one day I went to the park. I went home. The end. Probably not a very good story, and certainly not one that would sell any books, right? Or I couldn't make a motion picture movie by just telling someone I went to the park. There needs to be some action or drama or something, right? To pull in the reader or to pull in that person that's going to buy that movie ticket. So there's usually a problem. And the problem doesn't have to be a bad thing. It could just be a conflict or maybe a feeling somebody has. So when we think of problem, it's something we want to solve or make better or figure out, but it doesn't always have to be bad. But normally in a story, there's some conflict or trouble, right? Something just isn't going right. But let's back up a little and talk about the character. So when I have characters in a story, if I just say the boy was at the park, my reader might not know what I'm talking about. But if I say the very small, frightened boy was at the park, now you know how I feel. Maybe not how I talk yet, but how I act. I'm going to be very timid, right? So the reader that's reading my story gets a better picture of what I want them to see, right? The setting. The setting isn't just the place. If I'm really describing my setting and I want you to go exactly what I'm thinking about, I want my reader to think about, then I want them to know that the park wasn't just the park. The park was the lively, loud, exciting park, or the scary, spooky park, right? So I'm going to describe my setting in the beginning, so my reader goes to that setting and not another one they may have gone to in another story. And then let's move to the problem. The problem is the why I'm telling you this story, why I want you to stick around and see what happens, right? So usually some conflict in the story or something that's just not making it go right. And then if it just ends there, the character should do something about the problem, right? Or somebody else should do something to help the characters with the problem. So we call that the solution, or how we work together to solve it, right? And normally, people think the story ends there. But because of something called cause and effect, the story doesn't end there. Because everything we do has a chain reaction, right? Cause and effect. So if I solve the problem, how are the characters feeling in the end? The consequence of the solution, right? So that's why a story goes in order, because at the end, when the problem is solved, what now? For example, a real life example right now, when the problem is solved and we are no longer facing this crisis of we have to stay home to stay healthy, the solution is we're going to have a solution. We don't know what it is yet. We're working on it. But what's the solution? We don't know. But once we solve it, then what's going to be the consequence? We're going to be back in the classrooms. We're going to be back on the playgrounds. We're going to be back at the stores. We're going to be back at the ballpark. That's going to be a consequence of the solution. The solution's not going to the ballpark and everybody watching the game together. The solution's going to have to happen before the consequence. So at the end, the happily ever after, in most stories, right, is the consequence. Because we had to solve the problem, we had to have a problem, we had to have a place with some characters, right? So when we think about what makes a story, it's all of these things. And a great author will get our image in our head to be exactly what they're thinking. And they're going to use that through developing the story elements, right? So let's look at an example of that, of a great story writer and how they told their story. So we're going to watch a story, because we go to the movies and we think, oh, it's just a movie, it's just on the screen, there's actors. But as you know, movie makers, you don't start there. You had to have a story, right? And so that story had to have all of these story elements. So we're going to look at that today. We're going to look at a story. And the writers of this movie, the script, might have had a different opinion on what their problem was, their solution, their consequence, but I can't go find those movie writers. The person watching or the person reading that book will not talk to the author and say, well, what did you mean to say? So that author or the movie writer has to do a very good job of developing those ideas. So you as authors need to remember that it's not what's in your head, it's what's in the reader's head that makes your story come alive. You need to explain and be descriptive and use adjectives to describe your nouns or characters, and use adverbs to describe how your characters are doing something, right? You need vivid text in a story, or you need vivid imagery in movies. So I'm going to stop talking for a moment and we're going to sit back and enjoy a movie. And we're looking for the characters, the setting, problem, solution, and consequence. So let's check it out.
Lily and Josh have a good idea in their dreams, but they think they're too little to make it happen. But they're not. They each have a dream to become something spectacular. Josh wants to be an astronaut, and Lily wants to be a zookeeper, but they have nobody to encourage them. You see, they have been separated for a long time because they are in different rooms and don't talk. wait to be a zookeeper. Is there anyone else who They spend their days alone with their own dreams. One day, they both happen to cross. It was not normal for them to eat at the same time. They suddenly remembered the great times they had when they were younger. They were so excited that they started talking at the same time and sharing their dreams. Today, many years later, they have lunch together at the zoo. Lily works. But only on days when Josh is not out on a mission exploring outer space.
So, let's talk about...
Lily and Josh.
Oops. Thank you, narrator. So let's talk about the story elements in that movie. The characters. Who do you think the characters were?
Lily.
Oops. The narrator tells us, right? Lily and Josh. And they were really the only ones in the movie. So I don't know if I can read it. Lily, Josh. And writing in cursive on the screen is really helpful because I don't have to lift my pen up. Setting. When and where did this story take place? And if you remember, this setting changed throughout the movie. It kind of traveled through time, right? Even though the movie was only 3 minutes long, it really took us through their life, right? It began in the beginning, the setting was at home during their childhood, right? And then towards the middle and the end, the time changed, like they were grown. Josh was now an astronaut and Lily was a zookeeper. So they're not that as children, so they had to go through their lives, right? So even though this movie was 3 minutes long and it was filmed in a week, they really used words to show us that time changed, right? And that was very creative, I thought. So it was at home when they were young, that's when and where, right? And then it transitioned to the zoo and space, right? That was really cool. I wonder how Josh was able to fly. Is he really an astronaut? And the problem, what problem did they have in the story? Sometimes the problem is we're looking for one little thing. But it could be just like a feeling, right? What do you think the problem was? I think in the beginning the problem was that they didn't have anybody to support them. And the narrator really gave us some clues for that, didn't she? So problem is no support. And maybe because they didn't have support, we can infer or make an inference that they weren't really going to work hard for their dreams. They were just going to give up because nobody believed in them. It happens sometimes. So maybe that happened with these characters. The solution. What happens in the story to solve that problem? Remember, the solution has to solve that problem, right? It goes in a chain. So something happened in the story when they bumped into each other. But did that solve the problem? Magically it happened? That was the kind of turning point, the event, right? But how did they solve the problem of not having support? Do you remember? The narrator said it. I believe the narrator said they started talking. And they started sharing their dreams and they got excited. So it doesn't say that they supported each other, but I can make an inference again. And I can say, because they talked to each other, that they supported each other, right? And this is very sloppy cursive. So then the consequence. Was the consequence just that they talked? They weren't lonely anymore, they talked? No. You're right. It was much bigger than that, right? So the consequence, what happens because they solved the problem, is that their dreams came true. We saw that. Lily was the zookeeper. Mr. Astronaut was out in space. He waved to us from there. So the consequence was that their dreams came true. Pretty interesting that we can find these story elements even in a movie. And you'll notice that sometimes you have to make an inference. Class, what is inference? Good job. When we inference, we come up with an answer based on clues that the story writer gives us, and we make a connection to maybe something we already know, maybe other things that are happening in the story, maybe the character's feelings, actions. So, now Ty, it's your turn. This morning you're going to use your shared reading strategies, peanut butter jelly time, to read a story with your group. All right? So you have a shared, you're going to have this document in PowerPoint. You're going to open it up in PowerPoint, and then you're going to stay in the meeting and hear each other read. I know we haven't had shared reading for a while like this. So you're going to use peanut butter jelly to sandwich up. And then peanut butter is going to read the story. Jelly's going to listen. You're going to provide feedback. Tell me something good. Jelly, ready to read? Tell me something good. So we're going to use our strategy during our morning meeting this morning to interact with each other, to have shared reading experiences, most importantly to provide feedback on how we're reading aloud. And you'll see that your story, I know some of you were saying it wasn't big enough in season. It's pretty big now. And you're going to be able to write on this. You're going to see my writing right here, right? And it's going to be important that you can write on this. Not when you're reading, because that's going to be distracting. Both pages are in there. Once you have done your peanut butter jelly time, you are going to find the story elements. Just like we would do sight words hunts, you're going to do story elements hunts. And you see I've put a marker on each of the story elements. So to find the characters, you're going to go back to the story and use yellow marker in PowerPoint to identify the characters in the story. Then you're going to use blue marker to identify the setting. And they might not say the setting directly, but you have to find clues. And then you're going to write the setting right here. Yeah, you're going to write the characters here. You're going to write the setting here. You're going to write the problem here after you have found it and used that color marker. All right? So I'm going to find the problem in the story. find the solution, and then find the consequence. Remember, usually this is the beginning, middle, end, right? So it usually goes in sequence, the story elements. They might blend together. If it's a really short story, I might get the character, setting, and problem all in the first 2 sentences, right? If it's a really short story, I'm going to get it all in 1 paragraph. But there's always these elements in the story. A really long story, I might not know the problem for quite some time because they're developing the setting and the characters. So it's going to be your turn, Tigers, to report back what you find in The Fox and the Stork.